October 24th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle doesn't just make noise, it breathes. A thick, wet breath that clings to the skin and fills the lungs with the smell of rot and rain. For Sergeant John Battalion of the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, this sound, this smell, was the only world that existed. He ran a hand over his face, sweat and mud mixing under his palm, and stared out from his sandbagged machine gun nest. The position was a raw wound carved into the crest of a low, muddy ridge overlooking the Lunga River. Below him, the jungle was a solid wall of blackness, a place where shadows moved even when the wind was still. Beside him, PFC Nash Phillips shivered, though the air was a suffocating blanket. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice barely a crackle above the drone of a million insects. "You hear that?" Battalion didn't answer right away. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his whole body. He was feeling for the change in the rhythm of the night. For weeks, the rhythm had been the same. The far-off crump of naval guns, the distant chatter of a skirmish, the endless, maddening chorus of the jungle. But now, something was different. A subtle shift in the darkness. A silence where there should be sound. The crickets had stopped their chirping. That was the first warning. He keyed the small field telephone. The line hissed with static. "Charlie 17 to Puller. Anything on your end? Over." The voice of Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller came back, strained and sharp. "Negative, Sergeant, but the brass hats are expecting company. Big company. Colonel Sendai's whole damn regiment is out there somewhere. How's your sector?" "Quiet, sir. Too quiet." Battalions' eyes scanned the impenetrable black. His 2 machine gun sections, about 15 men in total, were dug in along a narrow 30-yard front. They were the hinge on the far left flank of the entire Marine perimeter defending Henderson Field. An afterthought, a tripwire. If the Japanese hit them, it meant the main attack was coming from an unexpected direction. If they hit them, they would hit them with everything. "Hold that ground, Battalion," Puller's voice crackled. "Hold it at all costs. You're the cork in the bottle. You get me?" "We'll hold it, sir." Battalion hung up the phone. The words, "at all costs," hung in the humid air. Everyone in the pits knew what that meant. There would be no retreat. No reinforcements were waiting just behind the lines. Their job was to die here, buying time for the main force to pivot and meet the threat. It was a cold, simple piece of military calculus, a small sacrifice for the greater good. It was a death sentence. He looked over at Phillips, then at the other young faces peering from their foxholes, boys trying to wear the masks of men. They were all thinking it. He could see it in their wide, unblinking eyes. They had been sent here to die. Suddenly, a flare shot up from the Japanese lines, casting the jungle in a ghastly, flickering green light. For a split second, the world was illuminated. And in that moment, Battalion saw them. Not ghosts, not shadows, men. Hundreds of them. A sea of figures rising from the jungle floor, bayonets fixed to their Arasaka rifles, glinting like slivers of ice in the eerie light. They were less than 200 yards away. The flare died, plunging the world back into absolute blackness. But the image was burned into his mind. Then came the sound, a low, guttural chanting that grew and grew, a wave of noise that seemed to make the very ground tremble. It wasn't the sound of an army, it was the sound of a force of nature. "Banzai." The whisper started, then grew into a roar. "Banzai!" The scream hits the Marine line like a physical blow. It's not a battle cry of hope. It's a sound of furious, absolute commitment. A promise of death given and received. For the young Marines in their foxholes, many of whom have never been in combat before, the sound is paralyzing. It is the sound of the abyss opening up. But for Gunnery Sergeant John Battalion, it is a switch being flipped. The waiting is over. The work has begun. "Open fire," he roars, his voice cutting through the rising panic. The two M1917 Browning machine guns erupt in unison. Their deafening, rhythmic hammering, chug, 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 shatters the night. Red tracers slice through the darkness, reaching out like fiery fingers into the jungle. The effect is instantaneous and horrific. The first wave of Japanese soldiers, emerging from the tree line in a dead run, bayonets gleaming under the pale moonlight, slams into a wall of lead. Bodies are thrown backward, twisted into grotesque shapes. The charge doesn't slow. It's not a tactical advance, it's a human flood. For every soldier that falls, two more seem to take his place, leaping over the bodies of their comrades, their screams never wavering. Battalion moves between his two gun pits, designated Gun 3 and Gun 4. He is not a distant commander. He is a mechanic of violence, a master of his craft. He shoves a fresh belt of ammunition into the feed tray of one gun while screaming corrections to the other. "Traverse left, left, they're in the gully." The air grows thick with the smell of burnt gunpowder, hot metal, and blood. Steam billows from the water jackets of the machine guns as the barrels heat to incredible temperatures. The Japanese mortars start to fall. They land with a sickening crump, sending geysers of mud and steel shrapnel flying in every direction. A round lands near Gun 3. The gun goes silent. Battalion crawls through the churning mud toward the pit. Two of his men are down, wounded and screaming. The gunner, a private barely 18 years old, is dead, slumped over the weapon. The gun is jammed, a ruptured cartridge stuck in the chamber. The flank is now wide open. The Japanese soldiers, seeing the DAP, begin to exploit it, pouring toward the silenced gun. Panic begins to set in along the line. Rifle fire becomes sporadic, desperate. More men are falling. Battalion knows that if that gun pit is overrun, the enemy will be behind them. The entire position will fold in on itself. He grabs the dead private, pulling him away from the gun with a grunt, his hands immediately finding the cool steel of the receiver. He needs to clear the stoppage. But he needs more ammunition. The runner he sent for more belts hasn't returned. He scans the darkness and sees why. The boy's body lies 20 yards back, a dark shape in the mud. The main ammo line has been cut off by the intensity of the assault. Gun 4 is still firing, but its rate of fire is slowing. Corporal Phillips is firing in shorter, more controlled bursts, conserving what little ammunition he has left. He's screaming for more belts. They are being consumed by the firefight, swallowed by the insatiable appetite of the guns. Without ammunition, these positions are just holes in the ground, graves waiting to be filled. They have maybe 2 minutes of firing left. The Japanese are getting closer. You can see their faces now in the muzzle flashes, contorted masks of fury. They are just yards away. The math is simple and brutal. The line is about to break. In that instant, with 300 rifles aimed at his pit and a tide of screaming men about to crash over the sandbags, time seemed to slow for John Battalion. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. There was only the gun, the jammed gun. "Cover me," he yelled to Phillips, who immediately began firing his Colt M1911 pistol over the parapet, the weapon's sharp bark a pathetic pop gun against the storm. Battalion ignored the bullets snapping around him and threw himself at the machine gun. He didn't have tools. He didn't have time. He used his bare hands. He yanked at the charging handle, but it wouldn't budge. He could feel the heat radiating from the weapon, a shimmering haze in the dark. Without hesitating, he grabbed the barrel jacket. The searing pain was instantaneous, the smell of his own burning flesh rising in the air. He gritted his teeth, a guttural growl escaping his throat, and ignored it. He was a mechanic, and this was his machine. He put his full weight into it, his muscles screaming, and cleared the stoppage, ramming the bolt home. He slapped the cover down, pulled the handle again, and the gun was alive. He dropped back behind the sights, his hands blistered and raw, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared back to life, catching the lead attackers just as they reached the barbed wire in front of his position. The effect was horrifyingly intimate. He wasn't just firing at shapes anymore, he was firing at men, seeing them torn apart by the .30 caliber rounds. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The first wave, decimated and shocked by the resurrected gun, finally broke, its remnants melting back into the jungle. A momentary silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the frantic clicking of the cooling machine gun. Battalion breath came in ragged gasps. His hands were on fire. "They killed the crew on gun 2, Phillips said, his voice numb with shock as he stared at the wrecked emplacement. "They're all dead, Sarge." Battalion didn't pause. He knew what had to be done. The Japanese would regroup, they would come again, and this time they'd know his gun was the only one left. He couldn't hold the line from one position. "Give me a hand," he barked. He disconnected the M1917 from its tripod, hefting the 40-pound weapon into his arms. The barrel jacket was still hot enough to cook on, but he cradled it like a child. Grabbed the tripod and a belt. Together, he and Phillips scrambled out of their relatively safe pit and into the open, sprinting through the mud and chaos toward the second emplacement 30 yards away. It felt like a mile. Bullets from Japanese snipers who had stayed behind after the main charge zipped around them. They dove into the ruined pit, landing among the bodies of their comrades. There was no time to mourn. They worked with a desperate, furious energy, setting up the tripod amidst the debris, mounting the heavy gun, and slapping in a fresh belt of ammunition. They were just in time. A second charge was forming in the darkness. Again, the cries of Banzai echoed from the jungle. But this time, the attack was different. It was more focused, more determined, aimed like a spear right at their new position. The Japanese knew this was the linchpin. If this gun fell, the flank would collapse. Battalion opened fire. The gun spat its familiar rhythm of death. But one gun wasn't enough. The Japanese were adapting, sending squads to the left and right, trying to flank the single point of resistance. Mortar rounds began to fall again, closer this time, bracketing their position. They were completely alone, an island of defiance in a sea of enemies. Battalion fired, Phillips fed the belt. They moved the gun, firing from one side of the wrecked pit, then the other, creating the illusion of multiple weapons. But the pile of spent brass was growing, and the stack of full ammo cans was shrinking. The Japanese just kept coming. The night bled on, an eternity of noise, fire, and fear. Each Banzai charge was a fresh nightmare, a wave of humanity Battalion and Phillips had to break with nothing but fire and will. After the third major assault was beaten back, a terrifying quiet fell over the battlefield. It was a silence filled with the metallic clicking of cooling guns and the labored breathing of two utterly exhausted men. Battalion took a moment to take stock. The ground in front of them was a carpet of bodies, a testament to the brutal effectiveness of the Browning. But their own situation was dire. He looked at the last few ammo cans. They were nearly empty, maybe 200 rounds left. Not even enough to stop a determined squad, let alone the next wave. And there would be a next wave. The main ammo dump was 100 yards back, behind the command post. 100 yards through a jungle that was now crawling with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated the lines during the chaos of the attacks. It wasn't a run, it was a suicide mission. But the alternative was to sit here and wait to be overrun when the bullets ran out. There was no choice. "Keep your head down," Battalion told Phillips, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Make every shot count. I'll be back." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his Colt pistol, took a deep breath, and vaulted over the back of the gun pit. He hit the ground and immediately began to low crawl through the mud and tangled roots. The darkness, once his enemy, was now his only ally. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a thunderclap in his ears. He moved by inches, freezing every few feet to listen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air was thick with the smell of blood and churned earth. He saw them before they saw him, a small group of Japanese soldiers moving silently toward the Marine lines. They were less than 20 feet away. Battalion flattened himself into the mud, tucking his face into his arm, praying they wouldn't see him. He could hear their quiet, guttural whispers, the soft scuff of their boots. One of them stopped, looking directly toward his position. For a heartbeat that lasted a lifetime, Battalion prepared to die. He tightened his grip on his pistol. Then the soldier moved on, disappearing into the shadows. He pressed forward, his senses on fire. The journey was a blur of close calls and silent terror. He navigated by instinct, moving toward the faint memory of a landmark, a shattered tree stump he'd noted earlier. Finally, he saw it, the dark outline of the command post bunker. He scrambled the last few feet and tumbled inside, gasping for air. A young lieutenant, his face pale in the light of a single lantern, looked at him in disbelief. "Sergeant, we thought your position was overrun. We heard your gun go silent." "We're out of ammo, sir," panted, his lungs burning. "I need belts, as many as I can carry." Without a word, other Marines began grabbing heavy cans of .30 caliber ammunition. They loaded him up, draping linked belts over his shoulders, pressing cans into his arms until he was bent under the weight of nearly 100 pounds of ordnance. He was a walking arsenal. "Godspeed, Sergeant," the lieutenant said, his voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for the dead. The trip back was even more harrowing. He was slower now, burdened by the immense weight. The clinking of the ammo cans seemed impossibly loud. He didn't have the luxury of stealth anymore. He had to move with purpose. He blundered through the undergrowth, half running, half stumbling, expecting a bayonet in his back at any second. Twice, he ran headlong into enemy patrols, firing his pistol from the hip, using the shock and surprise to break through their lines and continue his desperate race back to the gun. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a lifeline. He was the only thing standing between Nash Phillips and certain death. The only thing keeping the entire flank of the 1st Marine Division from collapsing into chaos. He crashed back into the gun pit like a collapsing building, dropping the heavy ammo cans to the muddy floor. Phillips, who had been nursing his last few rounds, stared at him as if he were seeing a ghost. Battallion's uniform was shredded, he was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and his face was a mask of mud and exhaustion. But he was there, and he had brought salvation in brass and steel. "Get it loaded," Battalion gasped, already tearing open a can. There was no time for relief, no time for celebration. In the distance, the horns and whistles of the Japanese NCOs were sounding again. They were forming up for another attack, a final desperate push before sunrise. They worked together in grim silence, a two-man machine of survival. Phillips fed a fresh belt into the Browning, while Battalion cleared the last of the spent casings from the pit to make room. He checked the water in the condenser can. It was nearly boiled away. The gun was dangerously hot, but it would have to hold. It had to. The 4th major charge came just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. This was the most ferocious attack yet. The Japanese soldiers, knowing their cover of darkness was fading, threw themselves forward with a final frenzied desperation. Mortar shells rained down, and machine gun fire from the jungle sought to suppress the lone American gun. But Battalion was a master of his craft. He met their fury with a cold, calculated torrent of fire. He no longer fired in long, continuous bursts that could overheat the barrel. He used short, precise 3 to 5 round bursts. Thud, thud, thud. Pause. Thud, 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 thud. Each burst found a target. He was aiming, conserving, making every single bullet from his desperate run count. He held the line not with brute force, but with lethal artistry. The Japanese assault, which should have swept over them in seconds, faltered, broke, and then dissolved under the relentless, methodical fire. As the sun finally broke over the ridge, the battlefield was revealed in the stark, unforgiving light of morning. The scene was apocalyptic. The ground in front of Battalion's position was a tangled, grotesque landscape of hundreds of Japanese dead, piled in heaps before the barbed wire. The jungle itself looked as if it had been chewed up and spat out. The last of the attackers had vanished, retreating with the dawn. The firing sputtered and died. In its place was a profound, ringing silence. Battalion finally let go of the machine gun's handles. His blistered hands screamed in protest. He slumped against the sandbags, his body completely spent, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. Beside him, Phillips just stared out at the carnage, his face a blank mask of shock. Minutes later, they heard American voices, the sound of Marines from the main line, cautiously advancing. An officer, a captain from Chesty Puller's staff, was the first to reach the pit. He stopped dead, his mouth falling open as he took in the scene. The two exhausted Marines, the mountain of spent brass casings that reached their knees, the two battered Browning machine guns, and the field of dead stretching out before them. "My God," the captain whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been sent to recover bodies. He expected to find a position wiped from the face of the earth. Instead, he found John Battalion and Nash Phillips, alive. They had been left behind. They had been sent to die. Instead, they had held. They had faced an entire Japanese battalion, wave after wave, and they had not yielded a single inch of ground. They had rewritten their orders with fire and blood.